Good evening, and welcome to episode 90 of the Political Mike podcast. Misinformation shared through the internet has reshaped American politics in the 21st century. For example, during the 2018 midterm elections, 54% of American voters revealed that they had seen fake news during the elections, and 19% reported that they believed it had influenced how they planned to vote. In fact, during the 2018 midterm elections, 59% of men were slightly more likely than women, 56%, to see political misinformation online. Among varying age groups, senior citizens at 60% were more likely than young people at 50% to see fake news. In regards to the impact that this misinformation has had on people and how they actually vote, there's also a disparity among genders. Men at 23% were more likely than women at 16% to say fake news had influenced how they voted. Senior citizens at 22% were more likely than those between the ages of 35 and 54, which were at 15%, to claim that fake news had influenced them. While in the abstract, it may appear that lies should be easy to identify and disprove, and that people wouldn't have to base their opinions based on what they see online and vote on false information, the reality is that they do read and rely on social media posts, on headlines that grab their attention on cable 24-hour news cycles, and other avenues of news. And we don't live in the abstract. Rather, we live in a reality where what you read on social media, what you see on the news can affect your views and your vote. And that's exactly why candidates who tend not like to waste precious campaign funds, and they're increasingly allocating funds towards advertisements on social media. Some of these candidate-funded ads are filled with truths, others with lies. The dissemination of misinformation through social media has yielded serious detrimental consequences that call for some kind of public policy solution. And so I'm so grateful to have with me Mr. Tony Brasunas, who was formerly an independent journalist. He was censored by the Huffington Post in 2016 for his coverage of the Democratic primary. He's been researching censorship, media's distortion, and disinformation in America for 5 years now, and he has the distinct hope that the underlying facts about fake news in America and the disinformation that is peddled every day in our corporate media will inspire Americans to exercise and defend their right to free speech and a free press. He grew up in an intentional community in West Virginia, spent an adventurous year in China, being lied to by the media, and now he lives with his wife and son in Sebastopol, California. Mr. Brasunas, thank you so much for being a part of the Political Mic. I want to start off the conversation by addressing your book, Red, White, and Blind. What inspired you to write this book, and where did you get the title from?
Great to have you, great to be here, Mike. Really appreciate being on the podcast with you here. So Red, White, and Blind started, you mentioned I was censored from Huffington Post in 2016, and that sort of is the event that kicked off writing Red, White, and Blind. I mean, I've been paying attention to censorship and bias and disinformation in the media for more like 20 years, and I could go back to sort of my first political awakening in 2000 and the Bush and Gore and Nader election, all of that. But I think for the sake of this conversation, a good place to start is 2016. I was covering the Democratic primary. It was between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders in 2016 on Huffington Post. And things were going fine. I was covering it from a whole range of angles. I was talking about the difference in fundraising capacity by Bernie and the Hillary campaigns, and how Sanders' side was able to raise money directly through people, and Hillary Clinton was raising her money mostly through large PACs, and so I did comparisons on that. I looked at some of the election irregularities in some of the primaries, which was a really interesting issue in independent media, covered that. But it wasn't until just the eve of the actual convention in 2016, neither Clinton nor Sanders had enough earned delegates to claim the nomination outright. So it was going to be a contested convention. It was going to come down to the super delegates, these people in the Democratic Party that get to vote with sort of the strength of 10,000 voters. They're typically party bigwigs and lobbyists and people like that. And so I wrote a piece that was basically saying I was arguing for the super delegates to choose Bernie Sanders. I thought it made more sense. Donald Trump had won the nomination on the Republican side. Bernie Sanders was polling much better against Trump in head-to-head polling, and also I really focused my article on the issue of trust, and on the issue of trust, there was this huge gap between the Sanders and Clinton candidacies among independent voters. And so the piece was the deeper reasons that intelligent progressives and independents will likely not support Hillary Clinton in the general election. And so I just laid out those arguments, and talked a bit about trust and a bit about why Hillary Clinton may not be trusted and why Bernie Sanders typically is, or was, at least in 2016. And I published the piece the evening, sort of a few days before the convention, and went to bed. And many of my pieces at the time were reaching 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, sometimes 100,000 views, and would be occasionally feature on the front page of Huffington Post. So that was fine. So I noticed it was starting to gain a lot of traffic and traction, and I went to sleep. And I woke up the next morning, and the piece was gone. It had been taken down. I was sacked. I would never write again for Huffington Post. It was all over in terms of that particular job. And so that was really the kickoff of trying to understand that and to see the censorship that was going on and that now I had personally experienced. And that started me on the road to Red, White, and Blind. So one whole chapter of Red, White, and Blind is about that experience of writing for Huffington Post and being censored at that particular time. So that's the start of it. Your other question, let me get to your other question, which was, how did I come up with the title? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, in the research that I've done over the last 3 years, I mean, I come from the left. I come from sort of Bernie Sanders and sort of that side of things. I was active in the Green Party in San Francisco in the early 2000s. So I was expecting to research this book and find that there was a lot more deception or disinformation or sort of just lies on the right. And that isn't what I found in writing the book. I found that it's very evenly distributed. There's a lot of distortion on both sides. There's a lot of truth on both sides. But by and large, the corporate mainstream media on both sides is full of different types of bias. And I really wanted to understand that. And sort of come up to convey that idea in the title of the book, that we are all in a state of deception. Every one of us, this is a very sophisticated propaganda instrument that made it the corporate mainstream media. It's been around for 100 years. With sophisticated propaganda techniques. And I wanted people to understand that this isn't just these people over here, the left, or these people over here, the right, or the Democrats, or the Republicans, or this people that think this or think that, or the race or the class, and we're all in this state of deception. We're all red, white, and blind. That the idea is that we're a country that is in a state of deception right now. And the subtitle of the book is The Truth About Disinformation, because I want us to understand where disinformation is coming from. And the other part of the subtitle is And the Path to Media Consciousness, because there is a path forward that I also want to talk about. So that's the title of the book. Yeah.
And so as we're getting further and further into the 21st century and news is taking on new forms, we now have a large portion of the electorate receiving their news from social media. And a case in point where misinformation has spilled outside of the world of politics and even into the realm of public health was within the controversy that surrounded the situation with the vaccination process at the Dodger Stadium in California. I think that was last year. You had Facebook, of course, has served as a huge platform where communities of people who are susceptible to believing almost anything gather together. They plan events, they network with one another. And so, Facebook groups that have railed against COVID-19 vaccinations have remained easy to find. And in fact, according to a series of searches conducted by CNN Business, 4 of the top 10 search results for vaccine on Facebook-owned Instagram were for anti-vaccination accounts, including Vaccine Truth, Vaccine Freedom, Anti-Vax, Know the Facts, and CV-19 vaccine reactions. And so these accessible pages, of course, contain misinformation, and they prove to yield real, tangible, harmful consequences. A case in point was at an anti-vaccination protest that was organized and planned through a Facebook page called Shop Mask Free Los Angeles, which promoted false claims about the coronavirus pandemic, about wearing masks and immunizations. And it temporarily cut off access to a mass vaccination site at Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles, California. And the Facebook page directed users to a Plandemic website that featured a wide range of videos devoted to the misinformation. So we're seeing, like public health consequences as a result of misinformation. In addition to political consequences. You have, huge portions of the electorate, being exposed to some misinformation, and depending on your political leanings, algorithms within these sites feed you information that you're more likely to click on. I guess clickbait is what they would call them. So what are the dangers of living in a society where you have so many variations of the same story? You have so many variations of, just different headlines on a regular basis. You've got folks who tune into MSNBC when they come home from work, and you got folks who tune into Fox and Newsmax. What are the dangers of living in a society that's continuing to be polarized by the news that they view and listen to?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we can get into some of the stuff about vaccines as well, because it's obviously a contentious issue on both sides. So I think there's this sense that that somehow we could have a neutral, unbiased media that would just sort of report the truth, and that would be the truth, and then everybody could either believe it or not believe it, and if it was false, it wouldn't appear in the media. And it'd be nice to have that. That would be a really nice thing, but it just doesn't exist. It's never existed. It's a myth that there was ever something called like there was just the New York Times or NPR or Fox, or there was one source. No, since the very founding of this country, the reason we have the free press is because it's known that people will see things, understand things, think about things differently. People report things differently. And it's critical to support that and to maintain the free press. And so if you go back to like the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, it was very common that you would have in any city dozens of newspapers. One would be, maybe the Italians' perspective on the news, or there might be like an abolitionist newspaper, and then there'd be the Democrats' newspaper, and there'd be this one and that one. And they would all report events very differently. And it was, nobody pretended that they were neutral. There was no pretensions, because nobody would believe it anyway. There was no notion that there was this sort of neutral way of telling the truth, because you couldn't you couldn't neutrally report on politics, because clearly your bias would come into play. It was only in the early 1900s, around the 19-teens, that this idea of professional journalism, that there would be non-biased professional journalists who would go to journalist schools, and they would only tell one version of the truth, and it would be the truth. And then the reason that they came up with that was done by some of the wealthiest people in this country at the time, David Rockefeller, the Rockefeller family, some of the other barons of big industry. And they realized that they wanted to be able to control the news. In order to control the news, they wanted to own all the newspapers. But there were a lot of people that were really complaining about this. You can't own all the newspapers if you also have all the money. So they came up with this idea, and they funded those journalism schools. And so it's only, and so there was this phase of like maybe 50 years there, 60 years there, where there was this idea of professional journalism. But the truth is, we're now going back into a time where there's multiple versions of the truth being reported at once. And so it can be disconcerting for people. Like you were just saying, people can be alarmed. Well, isn't this going to cause all kinds of problems? Aren't there going to be people that think the wrong thing about a vaccine, or think the wrong thing about a war, or abortion, or guns, or all these controversial issues? The truth is, that is democracy, and it's necessary for democracy, just like it's necessary for science. Not because false news is good. It'd be nice to have only truth. But because the minute you set up any type of arbiter that will select what speech is okay and what speech is not allowed, what the truth is and what the lies are, that body or that person will ultimately be corrupted, always. That will always happen. So you need to support free speech and a free press. So that's why when I hear these arguments that like, isn't it a problem? Isn't this huge problem that now there's various versions of the truth? No, that's actually what democracy looks like. That's what science looks like. And we're heading back to that. And it's a good thing. We used to have, that phase in the early 1900s when the Rockefellers and the barons were basically buying up all the newspapers. That went on for 100 years in this consolidation of corporate media to the point today where there's only 5 corporations that own everything basically that money can buy, every newspaper, every television network, every magazine, and now they're also taking over social media. So that's a really interesting development of social media. So the rise of independent media, of all these independent sources of the political mic that we can sit here and we can talk, and nobody's going to tell us that we can't. Nobody's going to say that can't go up online. Well, maybe now on YouTube they can, but I mean, there shouldn't be. we should be able to have this conversation, and then people can tune in and decide, is this useful information for me? Did I learn something from Tony Brasunas or Mike Taylor? Is this something that's worthwhile? If so, I'm going to watch more. If not, I'm going to turn it off and watch something else. This is what democracy looks like. And so I really encourage you and all your listeners to consider that we're actually in the rebirth of independent media. We're in the rebirth of a free media. And the New York Times and NPR and Fox, they want to put the milk back in the bottle. So they're going to tell us, be scared of independent media. Watch out for those crazy spreaders of disinformation. But what I found in this book, and this is what's so important to realize, is that the greatest spreader of disinformation, misinformation, is not independent media, although independent media has its biases as well. It's the large corporate media companies and the influence that the intelligence companies have on that, like what we're just seeing right now with the Twitter files. My book predicted that. Last year I was writing the book about my chapter about Twitter. That's what's going on. That's where the disinformation is really coming from. We do have to be aware of bias in other types. There's 3 types of bias, so we can get into that. But it's a long answer to a short question. Those are my thoughts on that.
So I'm glad you brought up misinformation through the internet. The Supreme Court ruled in Reno versus American Civil Liberties Union that under the First Amendment, the government does not have the power to regulate the transmission and display of content on the internet unless it does so for a compelling purpose and uses means that are narrowly tailored to that purpose. So in law school, in constitutional law especially, we learned, of course, that there are different tiers in which the Supreme Court would view certain regulations, especially as they pertain to civil liberties, specifically the First Amendment. And it seems like the Supreme Court, as it pertains to communications or anything that could be deemed as indecent on the internet, the Supreme Court would apply a strict scrutiny analysis, meaning that there has to be a specific end goal that the government is trying to achieve in the regulation. They can't just give a blanket regulation and expect this to just pass constitutional muster. I want to get your thoughts on whether or not that was a mistake in light of the fact that we've seen, for instance, you mentioned Twitter, so much, misleading, attention-grabbing headlines and clickbait being widely accessible, and we've seen the tangible effects it has on the electorate. I had a gentleman who was promoting, his book, based on George Washington and, the founding fathers, really intended for there to be a educated and well-informed electorate. What are your thoughts on the slippery slope that would be where, sources like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, you name it, YouTube, becomes the hub of so many lies and half-truths or complete falsehoods?
Well, again, we got to think about who's doing the lies and the falsehoods. I think that's the key. So if it's individual people lying and spreading falsehoods, then that's just part of human interaction. People sometimes lie. That's just how it is sometimes. And so I don't have as much concern for that. You're never going to stop people from lying. You're not going to stop people from fibbing if it helps them make a little more money. I mean, it'd be really hard to legislate something like that. But what we can pay attention to is very large organizations deliberately spreading falsehoods. And the largest purveyors of that, as we've seen, are the large corporations and the government. I mean, you'd seen, so one of the first things I talk about in my book is Jeffrey Epstein. So Jeffrey Epstein, I mean, it was, you couldn't imagine something worse, right? This is a pedophilia rape ring run at the apex of Western power. I mean, people like Bill Clinton and Bill Gates, Donald Trump, many, many more people were participating in this abhorrent pedophilia abduction ring for 20 years, and the media didn't report on it, right? So that's censorship, right? That's not some guy in his basement or some independent media channel. No, that's massive corruption at a huge scale, censoring a story. And what is gonna solve for that? What's gonna solve for that is independent media, is new media coming up and reporting on things that are censored in the Washington Post and the New York Times and NPR, that those channels are not going to touch because they're being manipulated and influenced. I spent a whole chapter in the book on Operation Mockingbird, which we now know it's declassified. I mean, the CIA placed agents, hundreds of agents, recruited hundreds of journalists and all of the top media institutions in our country, and lied to the American people. That's the kind of lying we have to be concerned about. That's what the First Amendment is for. The First Amendment is to prohibit the government from deliberately censoring speech or deliberately manipulating speech. That's a little bit different. The second part of it is propaganda. But so that's really the concern that I have. So with social media, like what we're seeing with the Twitter files now, we're now seeing that the government, the FBI, was deliberately telling Twitter, and it's probably what's happening at Facebook as well, and Google as well, and YouTube, that they had to censor if people asked about where did this virus come from. There's the other thing I talk about early in the book, in addition to Jeffrey Epstein, is how was it impossible for us to ask where the coronavirus originated from? For 2 whole years, you couldn't even ask, did this come out of that lab? Even though there was a lab in Wuhan, China, experimenting on coronaviruses at the highest level, almost certainly at this point, I mean, it's 97% certain it came out of that lab. But you still, in many places, you still will never get a neutral take on that in the New York Times. They're still going to report that it probably came out of this wet market. But at any rate, at this point, in most other media, you can talk about that. You can say this coronavirus almost certainly came out of this lab. But who was censoring that, right? Who was lying about that? That wasn't like individual independent media people. That was influenced by people at the very top. We now know is influenced by Fauci, who basically funded a lot of that research in Wuhan through the NIH. So that kind of deception, that's what we need to be concerned about. The Twitter files are showing us that the government and the FBI were basically telling Twitter, you have to censor any negative coverage about the vaccines. So you were saying earlier, you're concerned about there being too much negative coverage about the vaccines on social media. But what was actually going on, I'm pretty certain, what my research has turned on, is there was much, much more censorship the other way. There was much, much more bias that you couldn't say anything negative about vaccinations on social media. Like somebody like Robert Malone was pulled down. He was one of the co-founders of the technology behind mRNA, the mRNA technology. And he was saying, look, there's some reasons to be concerned. I'm not saying Robert Malone's right or wrong. I'm saying, how are you going to tell Twitter that they get to censor an expert? Or Martin Kulldorff at Harvard, one of the preeminent epidemiologists in the world, basically came out and had a tweet and said, look, it's the vaccine isn't for everyone. Certain people don't need it. If you've already had COVID, you have natural immunity, you don't need this. If you're young and healthy, the risks of myocarditis are greater than the benefits of the vaccine. Now, I'm not saying Martin Kulldorff is right or wrong. I'm saying, how is the leading epidemiologist in the world, right, who's researched this stuff way more than some guy at Twitter who's who's probably farmed it out to some people in Vietnam or whatever, who are basically handling these algorithms. So that kind of manipulation is really what Red, White, and Blind is about. We want to understand where this manipulation is coming from, what kinds of bias. And once we understand that, I think we can really get at exactly what should be the constitutional standard for free speech. Like these Supreme Court decisions, is it a violation of the First Amendment when Twitter pulls down Martin Kulldorff? Is that a violation of the First Amendment? I really get into that question in my book, and I'd love to discuss it. But I think those are the things that we want to really understand, so that we can have a flourishing democracy and we can have a flourishing science, scientific experimentation. Science will die if there's censorship. It will end. Democracy will end if we have censorship. So I reserve my strongest language for censorship in this book.
So the lead up to the 2022 midterm elections was fraught with discussions about misinformation. There were a lot of folks worried that misinformation would have a huge toll on the outcome of this past year's midterm election, about conspiracy theories and the role of social media companies playing in limiting the spread of fake news. However, the results of the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University's experts showed that misinformation did not win this year. In a fireside chat with McCourt school students, McCourt Institute grantee and provost distinguished associate professor Letitia Bode argued that platforms and tech elites have actually learned several important lessons since the 2016 and 2020 election cycles, and therefore they've been able to better combat misinformation online. She said that while most Americans were exposed to misinformation during the 2022 election cycle, there was a much smaller amount of falsehoods that were being spread online than in the past election years, due in large part to better algorithms built to catch misinformation before it spreads. What is your response to that assessment on, how these social media platforms have, approached the misinformation issue differently than in past election cycles? Do you think that it could be attributed to, better algorithms, like Professor Boat said, or do you think that there's some other factor that's not being considered or discussed on the national stage?
Well, I take issue with the entire idea that we need algorithms to basically take down false information. We don't need algorithms to take down false information. We should have social media that allows free speech, that allows people to communicate. And if people vote a certain way because they heard something that was not true, then they voted a certain way because they heard something that was not true. I mean, that's always happened. That's gone on for the entire history of the country. You either believe in democracy or you don't. I mean, if you think that you can manipulate what people hear and that that's somehow helpful, then you're not really running a democracy at that point. So I would say, if we look at the misinformation, I mean, what we now know about the Hunter Biden laptop thing, for instance, or the bounties. There was a story in 2020 when right before the election, it was reported that there were these bounties placed on these bounties paid by Russia to Afghanistan soldiers to basically kill Americans. And this story was basically brought out to attack Trump. And I'm no fan of Donald Trump, but I looked at that story and it was purely false. And it was reported by the New York Times and the Washington Post. And the story took damage against the Trump campaign, damaged the Trump campaign. And then about 6 months later, they walked it back and they said, oh yeah, there was never any evidence of that story. It was not true. It was weakly sourced. So that's the kind of misinformation I'd like to hear this professor talk about. If you're going to talk about misinformation that comes out of NPR and the New York Times and Fox and the corporate media, and also that comes out of social media, if social media is manipulating a story, they're censoring, Mark Zuckerberg has now come out and said, yes, the FBI told us that we had to censor the Hunter Biden laptop story because it was right on the eve of the election and it made the Biden and his son look really bad. They had all of this sort of corruption around Ukraine. And that certainly affected the election in 2020, but probably in the other direction than your professor is talking about. I mean, that certainly helped the Biden administration considerably, that censorship. So I would say if we look at this, if we're able to look at it from both sides, if we look at it from a bipartisan standpoint, which I do now because I've written this book and I see it coming from both sides, then I think it's a really interesting conversation. But we have to give equal, if not, I would say much stronger concern about the kind of manipulation that's coming from the government and the intelligence agencies manipulating social media, manipulating the New York Times and NPR. That's what's really important. And that's what Red, White, and Blind uncovers, looking at Operation Mockingbird. And that happened in the 60s and 70s, but I write a whole bunch about, well, is this still going on in Red, White, and Blind? And yes, there's so much evidence that this is still going on. I mean, during the Obama administration, the ban on propaganda was repealed. It was for 60 years, the government was not allowed to directly promulgate propaganda in the United States. And then that changed under Obama. And then it was funded. And I think that played a big role in the government playing such a huge role in pushing the COVID narratives that we now know many of them were incorrect. I mean, for the first 2 years, you weren't allowed to say, look, this vaccine probably doesn't stop the spread of the virus. And people were saying that, but they were banned. Now we know that the vaccine doesn't stop the spread of the virus. That's clear. And they never even tested for that. It might reduce it a little bit for a couple months, but then that wears off. So again, it's the point is not to try to establish that one side is true or false. That's not what I'm doing with Red, White, and Blind. I'm basically saying we have to understand that we're all in this state of deception from the mainstream media and the intelligence organizations that are manipulating them, and also from social media manipulation that's doing some of the same roles. And there's these different types of bias. So I guess in conclusion, whether 2022 had less misinformation than 2020 is not something that I've analyzed.
So I wrote a paper about, misinformation being spread through algorithms and artificial intelligence. My third year in law school. And what I was surprised to learn was that data processing is not new. In fact, data processing has come a very long way since 1960. But the primary purpose of data processing, for which it was used largely, remains the same. You had the Kennedy campaign, Bobby Kennedy actually trying to tap into this new method of basically taking the temperature of the electorate to see where they are on issues. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on how far data processing has come and whether or not the fine line between data processing and also influencing, based on that data processing, the opinions and beliefs of voters, whether or not that line can still be, carefully drawn to ensure that folks could make an educated decision when they go in the voting booth without being, fed misinformation just based on whatever their political leanings are, and based on what social media decides to feed them.
Well, yeah, there's an interesting segment. So in my section on, I look at Facebook and Twitter and Google in the book, in Red, White, and Blind. And one of the interesting things I found about Facebook is that they've done a bunch of experiments on their users, often without their users' knowledge. And they did this one experiment in California, in Southern California. This was, I think, in 2017. I'd have to double check the year. It was in that era. And they basically, right around an election, they took two groups of users and they served one group of users lots of like nice notices about it's time to go vote, and these are some of the issues in the right. These little things pop up in Facebook, election day. But then the other group, they didn't serve these little notices, and they didn't do the kind of like nice things about a particular side of the issue. And they wanted to measure like how much impact do we have on the election, and it was tremendous. They were able to flip like about 10% of people from not voting to voting, just with their little manipulations. And so there's this professor, his name's Robert Epstein, very different Epstein. He is a psychologist. He was the editor of Psychology Today. And he wrote this very interesting paper. He's written several articles. He actually testified to Congress. And he said, based on the things that Google and Facebook have developed, they could swing as many as 15 million votes in an election. By manipulating. So that is very important. We need to understand, and with these Twitter files coming out, showing the level of intervention that groups like the FBI and the CIA and the intelligence community are directly communicating with Twitter and with Facebook and Google and YouTube, and we know that they can swing as many as 15 million votes. That's where we need to be looking. We need to be looking at, this is not constitutional. This is not allowed. You can't have the government going in. Basically, and you can probably appreciate this from a First Amendment standpoint, right? Case law and precedent is the government cannot do through an intermediary what it could not do on its own, right? So the government couldn't come in and say, Tony Brasunas, you're not allowed to talk about, Ukraine. But so because they can't do that, they can't also go and tell Twitter to ban Tony Brasunas if he says this one thing about Ukraine, right? That would be just as much of a violation of the First Amendment. And so we need to look at that, because that, I think, is going on. I think that's what the Twitter files are revealing, is that we're in an era of, and I'm optimistic about it. I think this is an era of an unveiling. I think we're in this like sort of, this is what I call the new enlightenment in my book. I think we're in an era similar to when, so, there's a little bit of history, but when Johann Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press, this is like 1440s. We're just, Europe was still in the Dark Ages, basically the Middle Ages. Very few people had books. All the books were written by monks, sort of copying them by hand. The Catholic Church and the feudal lords basically had all the power. And by inventing this printing press, pretty soon, it was within about 50 years, the number of books in Europe went from like 12,000 books to like 500,000 books. And the number of people that could read and write just exploded. And suddenly you had the Renaissance. And then you had the Reformation, which challenged all of religion. Renaissance was a birth of science and philosophy. And then you had the revolutions, and you had what led to the United States of America and the French Revolution, and this sort of ferment of what we now call Western civilization came out of that. And it really came out of the invention of the printing press. And that it challenged and toppled these dominant top-down distribution of information that existed at that time. Like whether the earth was the center of the universe or the sun was the center of the universe. You weren't allowed, you were a crazy conspiracy theorist, to use today's language, if you said the sun was the center of the universe. They called you a blasphemer or a heretic. Today we'd say conspiracy theorist. But eventually they weren't able to keep it down because of the flowering that was brought about, this enlightenment that was brought about by the movable type printing press. We're in a similar era now. We're in like the second inning of a 9-inning game. The internet is like the printing press. We're moving into this era now where distribution of information is going to be completely changed. We're moving out of a top-down distribution of information model, which is right now it's the Fox and the NPR and the New York Times and the ABC, MSNBC, NBC. We're moving out of that model. It's being challenged by this upswell, this new enlightenment of people like us able to connect on the internet and directly generate our own information, directly generate our own knowledge, directly report our own facts and analysis, and then form opinions, and then go back into our larger democracy and vote based on those opinions. And it's a beautiful thing. I think I'm optimistic about it. I end the book in an optimistic place, even though the first like 2/3 of the book are kind of dark, because I'm going through and I'm saying, here's all the ways we've been deceived. The first, Jeffrey Epstein, coronavirus, the Iraq War, all of these different things, Operation Mockingbird, and the things I talked about like the Hunter Biden laptop, and the times that we've been deceived. But I need to portray those in Red, White, and Blind so that people understand the state of the problem. But we're also moving into this really positive place, and I think there's a real thirst and a real hunger for people to connect on shows like this one and to figure things out for themselves and to train our own brains and our own minds to distinguish the misinformation from the truth, rather than let somebody else tell us what's true and what's false.
So, Mr. Brasunas, even if there's propaganda and disinformation in the United States media, isn't the Chinese and Russian media much more distorted and much more filled with propaganda than our media?
Great question. So I spent a bit of time in China. Right out of college, I went to China. My first book is all about my experiences in China. It's called Double Happiness. It changed my life. I recommend the book if you're interested in sort of coming of age of a young American in a very foreign place. And China is a beautiful country, and I had an amazing time there. And yeah, we don't want anything to do with their government system. We don't want anything to do with their media system. So I just want to be very clear. There's things about China that I love and admire, and they're parts of the Chinese government system. And they never had an enlightenment. They never had the notion of individual rights. That stuff never happened. There was no Renaissance Reformation in that culture. So yeah, one of my, big part of my awakening was being in China and seeing oh, wow, the media is really distorted here. But what is interesting, and I was there in 2001 when this spy plane went down over Hainan Island, and I was able to watch, because at that point my Chinese was good enough where I could pretty much piece together the newspaper reports in China. And there was the internet was a thing at the time, and I could go on a website like the CNN or New York Times and read the American perspective and see how different the versions of the story were. One side it was like, how they, why do the Americans think they can fly spy planes over our country? And then the Chinese was like, or that's the Chinese perspective. The Americans are like, how do the Chinese think they can shoot down our plane? This whole thing. What I would say is, yes, the Chinese media is more blatantly, obviously distorted. It's a much thicker, much more distracting, or much more intense, complete type of propaganda and censorship. But the censorship and the propaganda system we have in this country is as deceptive as that one. This is what I've realized. It's as deceptive, but it's much, much more sophisticated. We have this illusion of this cornucopia of sources, right? That you can oh, well, if I don't want to read the New York Times, I'll read the Atlantic. And if I don't want to read the Atlantic, I'll read Harper's, but they're the same. They're basically the same mindset, the same people saying the same things, and they're going to end up having the same biases, and there's going to be the same nefarious bias coming in from intelligence sources and things like that. So while we have a much broader array of choices, if you stick to the corporate media, we're all red, white, and blind. And that state of deception is similar to the state that the Chinese people have. In fact, the Chinese people have one advantage over Americans, and that is the Chinese people, most of them know that the media they're getting is false. They know that it's lies. And so that gives you a certain amount of awareness. Doesn't necessarily mean you have an easier time finding the truth in China. I would say you have a harder time finding the truth in China, but more people know that it's false, that what they're reading. In the United States, we have this amazing ability. We can still access a wider variety of options. Although we did just ban RT, so it's not a very good look. But the RT America, which is the Russian news channel in the United States, was basically shut down by U.S. forces. And I think that's really I mean, what would you say if China shut down the Voice of America? You know, you'd say, oh, well, they're just concerned that their lies are going to be revealed by Voice of America. So you should say the same thing. You should say we should allow Russia to broadcast its version of the news into our country, and same with China. Because if we think we're a free people, we should be able to handle any version of the facts and then be able to figure it out for ourselves. And there were actually a lot of people on RT that were Americans, American dissidents that were able to speak there. So, yeah, I mean, the Russian media and the Chinese media are certainly biased, certainly distorted, certainly deceptive, but they do have one advantage over Americans in the sense that people there know it. And that's an important thing. It's an important part of media consciousness, is to realize that we are in a state of deception.
So what do you make of, those who may argue, well, look at January the 6th. We had folks storming the Capitol, right? This is something that didn't even take place during the Civil War, when the country was at war with itself, where you had, the Confederate flag being marched through the halls of the Rotunda. What if people point to that and say, listen, I hear what you're saying about, ensuring that everyone, all sides are represented, and, that no one is being shut out of the conversation. However, we do have tangible consequences that we can point to when we don't have a checked media. When conspiracy theories and lies are able to find homes and some of the living rooms of many Americans, and that turns into violent action. If we don't curb misinformation, then what other sources of recourse do we have to ensure that a January 6th like event, or even something more catastrophic, where public officials are actually probably executed on television? That was the one thing a lot of folks were grateful didn't happen with the 6th of January of 2021. How do we prevent something like that from happening if we are not willing to place limits and restrictions on certain sectors of the media?
So January 6th is a great topic. I do devote a little bit of time in Red, White, and Blind to it. I researched it in order to basically reasonably critique Twitter's ban of Donald Trump based on January 6th. So I had to look at it. I would say your accounting of January 6th that you just presented there is just one side of the story. And so I would challenge you to read some other perspectives on January 6th. Certainly I get it. Like, from one perspective, it was this attempted coup, and there was these people that wanted to overthrow the government. In my research, I don't think that's an accurate representation of what that was about. I think that January 6th was fundamentally a protest for better election security. And it was manipulated by a number of forces into looking like something that it wasn't, and that the media was distorted about it. It's obviously a contentious thing. It was awful to witness the violence that happened in the Capitol. But yeah, I don't think that there was something that happened on January 6th that is just wholly worse than what happened the summer before, when you had riots, all over different cities that were burning buildings and things like that. There was much more violence and many more injuries sustained in the riots that happened over Black Lives Matter and things like that, I would say. Now, those are very difficult to compare, and I don't really want to get into that. I would just say with January 6th, you have to basically say, well, if they were going to murder people inside the halls of power, why did none of them carry weapons, right? If Trump was trying to foment a insurrection, and a lot of these people are basically believers in the Second Amendment, why didn't any of them carry weapons? The other thing I would say is that you have to look at the presence of undercover FBI agents that were there. There's all kinds of evidence. I didn't even research that much, and dozens of it turned up of these guys like Ray Epps, who is there literally saying and telling everyone, and he's got this thing in his ear, and he's telling people we have to go into the Capitol, and a lot of the people are saying, no, we don't want to go into the Capitol. And he's pushing people to go into the Capitol. There's also manipulation, the way the New York Times covered it, where they said a number of people died or were killed there, and a lot of that reporting was actually false. No one actually, the only person that was killed inside of the Capitol was the protester who was shot by the FBI at point blank range. The other deaths were suicides that happened later, and one woman died of amphetamine overdose on the sidewalk. So I think January 6th, I just feel it's important to go there so that we don't let January 6th be used as some type of example of like the worst case scenario of something that could happen. It was a protest of people that thought the election was unfair. And we could get into that issue as well. I don't necessarily agree with that, but certainly protests should be allowed. And then I think that protest was manipulated, and a lot of things happened that were awful to watch. But it's not the kind of justification that you would say, okay, we need to then clamp down on the media, because this is what I'm really writing my book about. It's always the first thing that authoritarian governments want to do is to clamp down on the media. And it's really interesting for me because I come from the left. I come from a place like in the aftermath of 9/11, it was really people on the right that were calling for censorship. And we're saying we have to censor all the people and we have to silence people that don't have the right opinion, or you're with us or you're against us, and all this kind of stuff. And now it's been really interesting to witness, as I've written this book in the last 4 or 5 years, that I find a lot more people advocating for free speech on the right and people on the left that are really concerned that we have to somehow silence a lot of people. So I would just say January 6th is an issue. We could get into it, and there's a lot of reasonable, intelligent people that disagree as to what happened on that day, and I think it's really interesting. I do write about it in my book, and it's an interesting topic. But we have to be extremely careful before we let something like that be used to justify censorship, because there's no examples in history where the good guys wanted censorship. There's no examples of that. So there's many examples of like Stalin and Mao and Hitler, like all these people, they all wanted censorship. And censorship, again, we have to understand what free speech is, right? Free speech is not, I want people to be able to say things that I think are okay, that I kind of agree with, kind of disagree with. Noam Chomsky said it the best. He said, supporting free speech is supporting the people's right to say something you are terrified of and you find despicable. That's free speech. That's what supporting free speech is. It's supporting somebody's right to say something you find abhorrent, right? Now, there are some carve-outs, right? You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater, right? You can't deliberately defame somebody's character, right? There's already legal precedent for that, and that stuff should also be taken down from social media. But in terms of saying something that you think is really a dangerous idea, because one man's dangerous idea is another man's or woman's desperate need to be heard on something that's not being seen, right? Every group that's ever tried to push for some greater freedom or greater rights has had to say things that the majority did not want to be said. So we have to understand what supporting free speech means, and we have to understand that censorship is trying to remove that ability for people to speak freely.
So, Mr. Brasunas, what is your response to the Washington Post's article that multiple people bought firearms to Washington on January the 6th? And also, not just the January the 6th the event, but what happened after January the 6th. You had a lot of folks running for political office, specifically for Secretary of State, saying, I'm willing to overturn the election based on the conspiracy that was peddled, that fueled and resulted in culminated into January the 6th. What if folks say, listen, it's not just about the 6th, but about the future of democracy itself. We have democracy works when we have winners and losers, folks who are willing to admit defeat and folks who, win. And if we don't have that system, then we don't have a democracy. And then we resort to more political violence. What is your take on the Washington Post article on multiple weapons being brought, folks being charged and having to testify in court that they did bring firearms to the Capitol that day, and also the political ramifications from that event that have taken place, and we've seen in the form of a Carrie Lake like candidate and others who have taken to the national stage to say they're willing to overturn their state's electoral counts.
Yeah, great point. So I haven't seen any evidence that there was like widespread carrying of firearms. Maybe there were a few. I've seen very little of that. And I think that's one of the things that you would certainly see. I mean, a lot of them are Second Amendment defenders. And if they're going to go and storm the Capitol for a coup and try to overturn the government, you would see videos of them all with their guns and stuff. You just didn't see that. It looked much more like a protest. It looked much more like a group of people that were like, and that's what Donald Trump's speech was too. I parsed through his speech in my book and I looked for the most incendiary things. There's really not much there. There's a few things where he says we have to fight, but then he also says we have to be peaceful. It's an interesting thing. So we could get into it. And, if it turns out that somebody can show me video or footage of a big band of like hundreds or thousands of people like toting guns, I probably would change my opinion about it. In terms of the bigger point, though, I think it's a really good one. So right. So are we allowed to say that the winner didn't win an election, right? Or are we allowed to say our opponent cheated? And I would say in a strong democracy, yes. In a strong democracy, the time that one opponent says, I don't think it was fair, we should see that as a gift, as a moment that we can display to everyone how fair our democracy is. If we really believe we're living in a democracy and these elections are fair, somebody saying, I don't think that person got the votes they did, should be great. Should be a moment to say, yes, absolutely. If your democracy cannot sustain one person saying, I don't think I won, I don't think that the person over there won, I think I won, then your democracy is very fragile. And I think that's the truth. I think that might be my next book. I think the truth is, and I haven't researched this as much as I've researched the media, but the truth is in the last 20 years, we've steadily, slowly but surely replaced all of our old election systems, which were based on paper ballots, with electronic voting machines. And those electronic voting machines, almost all of them are run by 3 corporations, and they all claim their computer code is proprietary. And so we can't look at their computer code, which is ridiculous because the computer code for a voting thing should be 1 + 1 = 2, right? It's the most basic formula you could ever write. And yet they claim it's secret and it's proprietary, and you wonder why. Well, there's a huge amount of power. If you can basically manipulate who comes out of the tabulator is the winner, is not the winner, right? That's a huge amount of power. And the fact that the victors get to choose who gets the contract for the next election machines, they're probably not going to award the contract to somebody that said that their opponent won. So what I would say is what we have to acknowledge, and this is going to be maybe painful for some people, is we have to acknowledge that we don't know who won the election. We don't know. I'm not saying Trump won. I'm not saying Biden won. We don't know because these voting machines, when they run a recount, they just run the same computer code. They just like push run again, and it comes out with the same results, right? Until we get back to paper ballots or we do something that's transparent. And I've read a lot of really good stuff about like blockchain voting and things like that, where you could literally go and you could see your vote was counted for this person. It would maintain your privacy, but you would know for certain on this blockchain that your vote was counted for this person. We don't have that system. We have a trust system where you walk in, you push a button on a screen, something happens or doesn't, and you have to believe that it was counted. Now, I like faith. We could talk about if you believe in God, like I like faith, but I think we should have a trust but verify system. And so it's a painful thing to acknowledge, but I would say we don't really know who won the election while we're using these secretive codes, these voting machines that are running secret code. So for Trump to get up and say, look, I didn't win, Biden cheated, I think it's a distasteful thing to watch somebody say. It'd be much nicer to say, like basketball team that doesn't win, and they say, the other guy shot better than we did tonight or whatever, and we'll do better next time. That's a little more graceful thing to watch. But at the same time, if a team says the other guys cheated, then let's go back and look at the video. Let's go talk to the referee. Let's see if they cheated, right? Like it shouldn't be that now you hate basketball or now you hate soccer because you're saying that the other team didn't win, right? No. So I guess what I'm getting at is, no, it's not. Again, it's not justification for censorship. It's not justification. We shouldn't be censoring people that say, I didn't lose the election. We should say, okay, well, let's look at their grounds. Let's look at what they have to say. I've watched some of the documentaries that the right has presented, and I really recommend a lot in my book. I spent a lot of time on a balanced media diet. I think it's the first step to media consciousness. And so I do it. I practice what I preach. And so I've watched a number of the documentaries that lay out why people on the Trump side think that Trump won. And there's one called 2000 Mules. There's another one called Selection Code. They both have some issues in both documentaries, but they also both present things that I think are worth further investigation. So absolutely, we need to let those people speak. You need to let those people speak. And if they're wrong, they're wrong. Because the alternative of censoring people, of silencing people that say that the other side won, that never works. They never don't. The people that think that they were wrong don't just suddenly think that it was right now because they can't be heard anymore. That's the opposite of what you want. You need to bring this into the public conversation, not tell people that they're wrong and they're stupid. And I would even say the term conspiracy theory. I really use that in my book. That's a term like blasphemer or something. I would just ask you to consider what are you saying with the term conspiracy theorist? Because I think conspiracy theory is the idea that you read and you think And there are conspiracies happening all the time. I mean, with like, it's very, I think, common at this point to acknowledge war profiteering, right? Which is where wars tend to be advocated by the big corporations that'll make billions of dollars. So they're going to lie, and there's a conspiracy to like get another war started because they're going to make a lot of money. I think you could say similar things around pharmaceutical companies. Like they're going to make a lot more money when there's more illness. They're going to make a lot more money that way when they can sell more drugs. So you have to understand that analyzing things deeply and taking things, really or looking at things really deeply sometimes means you're coming up with a theory about wrongdoing, and that's okay. I think that's an important part of the media.
So, Mr. Brasunas, a little bit earlier in your answer, you mentioned that you believe that there is no clear winner. There's no clear understanding or consensus as to who the winner of this most recent presidential election is. But with that same logic, wouldn't all of the recent presidential elections since since the dawn of like digital voting tabulators, wouldn't all of those elections be called into question? I think 1996 was the first government election conducted over the internet, when you had the Reform Party's presidential primary being conducted over the internet. Internet voting was offered along with vote by mail and vote by phone as an option to party members who did not attend the party convention. I mean, wouldn't all of the recent presidential elections, not just the 2021, be up for debate now?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a great question. I think it's a great point. I would now it'd be interesting to go back hundreds of years, like I did with the media in this book, but at least let's go back 20, 25 years, like you just said. I mean, the Bush-Gore 2000 election, which ended up in the Supreme Court, Bush versus Gore, and the hanging chads and that whole thing. That was the first election I was old enough to vote in, so I remember it fairly well. That led to the Help America Vote Act. And just like the Patriot Act and a lot of these acts, it did sort of the opposite of what it says. So the Help America Vote Act basically gave huge chunks of change to set up electronic voting systems. The idea was that these would be easier to count and to recount. And it's really unclear if that's what it did. I think it's much more likely what it did is it set up these electronic voting machines all over the country. And so then in 2004, immediately, there's a number of books that look at what happened in Ohio. And at that point, it was the other side. It was more, and that was when it was more the left were more concerned about this issue. It's really been interesting to watch it flip, because that was the election that George W. Bush won. And it was very dubious what happened in Ohio that year. And there were a number of books written about it. I recommend one's by Mark Crispin Miller that I mentioned in my book. Another one's by Harvey Wasserman and Bob Fitrakis at the Ohio Free Press. It's called What Happened in Ohio is one of them. The other's called Fool Me Again, I think, or it was a sort of spoof on George Bush's fool me once, fool me twice. You can't fool me twice, or whatever he said. But the point of both those books is just looking at how electronic voting machines were used in Ohio, almost certainly to flip that state, and that state flipped the election. So I absolutely think 2004 should be looked at. I haven't looked as much into 2008, 12, and 16 was when I was censored at Huffington Post, and I was doing a little bit of research into some of the voting irregularities in the primary, and I think absolutely there was a lot of exit polling. So that was when they were doing exit polling, and exit polling is when they actually ask people after they voted, as they leave the polls, who'd you vote for? And it's much more accurate than asking people 2 days before who are you going to vote for, because people might get sick or not go to the polls or whatever. But you ask people, who did you just vote for? And you do it in this way that, they can balance for accuracy and stuff like that. And in those primaries, Bernie Sanders against Hillary Clinton, the reported results of the electronic voting machines went against the exit polls something like 20 times, and 19 of them were for Hillary Clinton. So, and there was mathematicians that did the odds, and they said the chances of this happening just by pure chance is like, 1 in many, many billion, just in terms of the mathematics. So I don't know for certain about that one, but yes, I think that one should be relooked at. 2004 for sure. 2020, I think so. I think it's absolutely there. And so I'm not saying Trump won, I'm not saying Biden won. I'm saying let's have the decency to say I'm not sure who won, because we don't have verified elections. We don't have elections that we can truly recount, and that's a big problem. So from a media perspective, I just think we should allow people to report on this and to talk about it from both sides.
So many have argued that in order to hold social media platforms like Facebook Twitter, and Instagram more accountable is through reforming Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Many argue that that law has to be reformed. And so what does Section 230 say? Well, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, subsection C, subsection 1, provides that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. And that's, again, Section 230, subsection C, subsection 1. So as a result of this provision, you have organizations. I mean, you have Facebook, companies like Facebook. You have Instagram, Twitter, other social media platforms, able to get away from being subject to litigation, to lawsuits, civil lawsuits, if there are misinformation found on their websites. And so by lifting the protections that many of these digital content intermediaries have enjoyed and allowing defamation suits to go forward, these digital content intermediaries would be compelled, many argue, to ensure that misinformation does not find its way onto their platforms. And so creating remedies against domestic intermediaries, they say, would offer those who have been defamed by fake news a potential route to a recourse. What is your response to the calls to reform Section 230, and do you think it will ultimately have the outcome that many of the proponents of reformation of that law say it will have?
Great question, and this really gets into a big point that I like to talk about, that I spend a bit of time in the book on. Yeah, so I think it's clear right now that the role that social media is playing in our society is it's not entirely healthy, and I think it's ran out ahead of regulation in a sense. It's gotten ahead of itself, and we're just now realizing, I think, over the last couple of years, the true power of social media, particularly when people were in their homes a lot during the pandemic. It was one of the main ways that people were able to actually connect with other human beings. So no, repealing Section 230, I don't think is a good idea, and I'll get into why that is. Section 230 would basically say that the social media companies are now liable if you say something on Facebook. If you say something on Facebook that's like deemed problematic, Facebook could be held liable for that. And what that would do is people say, and the people that want more censorship on social media, that want more, less free speech, basically, they think that that would be a good thing because they're worried about, dangerous ideas being promoted on social media. I think what you would, so first of all, I don't agree with that idea that would be better for society, would be a censored social media. I don't think that would be good. I also don't think repealing Section 230 would necessarily do that. I think you would end up in a place where the social media companies had this really difficult burden of determining what they could allow and what they couldn't allow. And I think you'd end up with these real splintered social media companies, each one serving small little sub-communities and things like that. What I propose in the book is, I think, two different regulatory models for social media. And they follow existing regulatory models we have in this country. And I think it's important to understand them. So one is the publisher model, and the other is the utility model. And so the publisher model basically is like repealing Section 230 and basically would treat social media companies like publishers. So they're now like, a company that publishes books or publishes newspapers. And so because of that, they would be held liable for anything they said. They would be considered the ultimate speakers in a certain sense. And in exchange for that, they would be allowed to, really exercise a lot of power politically in saying certain things can be said and other things can't. They would become powerful political players. I think that's just a bad path to go down. I think we would end up in a pretty negative situation. I think the utility model is a much better model, and that's the model we use for things like power companies and phone companies. Basically, what that does is it completely exonerates, or what's the word, indemnifies, I think is the word, these corporations from anything that's said on their channels. But in exchange, they have to serve everyone. They're even allowed to have monopolies because their pricing is regulated and they have to serve everyone. So for example, like if I say something to you on the phone that AT&T thinks is like, maybe I say something bad about the CEO of AT&T's uncle, they're not going to cut off my phone service, right? Or the water company isn't going to say, oh, you're watering your plants more than we want, we're going to cut off your water. Right? They don't get the ability to censor you. But on the other hand, they're not liable if I like drown someone with the water, or I don't know, I do something with my phone that is like a crime. They're not going to get sued for that. And so what that does is I think that really opens up a really optimal scenario of social media. We should see social media as utilities. These are things that are necessary for humans to connect with each other. That's what they're becoming. They're also becoming the town square politically. So the Supreme Court's already ruled that way. Another thing that's really important to realize is the political pressure that's already come to bear on social media companies. I think the threat of repealing 230 is being held over the heads of Facebook and Twitter and YouTube to get them to do the censorship that the government wants. Right. So the Biden administration has clearly, I would say, has clearly violated the Constitution, has violated the First Amendment. We now see this in the Twitter files in demanding social media companies to censor certain people. They deliberately called out Alex Berenson, this one particular journalist. The Constitution couldn't be clear on that. That's completely unconstitutional. That would be straight up despotism if the government could gag certain people just because it wanted to. Right. So we're already in a situation right now where the social media companies are being sort of bamboozled, I would say, by the government, being told by Congress, you have to regulate, you have to censor more people. The utility model, I think, is the right path out of that. I think what it does is it recognizes the true relevance and the true importance. At this point, we need social media. Humans depend on social media almost as much as they depend on power and water. I mean, you look at something like 70% of people use YouTube. I think 50% of people use Twitter. And I think it's like 75% of people use Facebook or something. This is within America. So that's my sense of it. I think we leave 230 where it is. We probably don't need it anymore once we go down the regulatory model of the utility model. The other thing about the utility model that's good is that it allows, to some extent, like I would say right now, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube are monopolies. They're monopolies within their space. And the utility model, it's okay with monopolies in a sense because you have this regulatory model whereby they're not able to ban certain people. They're not able to jack up their prices and things like that. So that's my sense on that.
So in Germany recently, December 7th, actually earlier this month, there was a far right coup that occurred that, had the goal of taking over the government, overturning the government, very similar to the January 6th insurrection. And so you had far-right coup plotters mapping out their own government. They had people chosen for cabinet-like roles if they succeeded in overthrowing Germany's elected leaders. And those were just some of the revelations revealed and shared by the German officials. At least 25 people were under arrest, including 22 suspected members of a terrorist organization, according to public prosecutor General Peter Frank. The conspiracy's goal was to overturn the existing state order based on democracy, using violence and to replace it with their own state. Now, I bring up Germany because in Germany, they enacted a law, the Network Enforcement Act in 2017. And although this act does not impose new obligations for social media, it does impose heavy fines for noncompliance with existing legislation and creates rules for the investigation and removal of illegal content hosted by networks with a very large number of social media platforms, having those or being responsible for spreading that misinformation. What is your response? Those who say, well, let's craft a federal legislative solution to misinformation here in the United States based on the Network Enforcement Act of 2015 that they had in Germany. You have other nations like China, Egypt, France, Germany, Israel, Malaysia, Russia enact morally focused legislation that imposes sanctions on social media networks that are responsible for spreading false news, usually imposing fines and ordering the removal of information identified as false. And I know it goes back to your question, who's going to be the arbiter of, what's true and what's not. But, crafting something in a mold similar to the German law, what is your take on that? And do you think it will be effective or not effective in curbing back some of the violence that we see coming out? Keep in mind, we had, what has been known as Pizzagate, where a gentleman was only listening to what was being fed to him by the gentleman who's now being sued or facing huge amounts of legal woes with the young kids who were killed in Connecticut. Alex Jones, I'm sorry. You have him being fed information by Alex Jones, going to the pizza shop in Washington, D.C. from North Carolina with a weapon, thinking that there are some kind of immoral things going on in that restaurant, only to find out that that was not true. Should we do something, and should that something look like Germany's law?
No, and I think that somehow, if we restrict people's ability to get information, if we try to basically this new enlightenment that I talk about that's flowering, it's posing a great threat to the powers that be. So they're going to use any way they can to try to get us to fear that. This is what the Catholic priests and the feudal lords did in the Middle Ages, is be scared of those, evil people that want you to think for yourself, that want you to read your own, read the Bible on your own, learn how to read. Don't learn how to read. Don't learn how to write. You don't need that. Just, the earth is the center of the universe. Like, pray to God the way we tell you to, and, stay a serf. That's what we're going on. That's what we're seeing right now. So, they're going to basically say, see how awful this is? See, like, this guy that went into a pizza restaurant thinking that there was pedophilia there. Well, we now know that Epstein was running a pedophilia ring for 20 years and that a lot of the power people, like Prince of England was there. It's not that crazy to think that there maybe was in the middle of Washington, D.C. pedophilia going on. I know it sounds distasteful. I'm not saying Pizzagate was correct, but it's not a crazy idea now that we know what was going on and that it was censored for 20 years. So what I'm saying is we need to continue to allow people to find information of their own. I don't like Alex Jones. I don't defend Alex Jones, but I don't think people should be censored because they're saying ideas, again, that other people find distasteful. This is what it means to support free speech, and it's so crucial. It's the United States is one of the few places on earth that has this tradition of true free speech, of actually supporting people saying things that you find dangerous. People will find somebody else saying something that might impinge on their own wealth and power. They're going to find that dangerous every time. That's going to be hate speech. That you're saying something that might impinge on my wealth and power. So, and to get to now, I don't know the Germany situation, and I would be curious to see which, if that was a balanced media report that presented it as a right-wing coup. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I know that the election in Italy was presented as a right-wing coup, and then I went in and researched that, and it wasn't. There's no reason to believe that was some wild right-wing coup. It was somebody that was conservative that won an election. But even if it was, I would say that that's another reason not to go down the publisher model of social media, because now they're basically holding social media responsible for an election or for a coup or something like that. Absolutely not. Social media should again be a utility. It should be seen as this is how people find information. And if people are finding information that causes them to, want to have a different type of government, that's part of how it goes. That's what democracy is. That's what democracy entails. I mean, one of the reasons that I think people should reaffirm their faith in democracy, because there's been definitely this idea in American society for going back to the founders that democracy is a little too dirty. It's a little too dangerous. What if the crazy people get in charge? Shouldn't we have just the experts run the government? Shouldn't we have just the educated people, just the people that look like me or have the same amount of wealth as me? Shouldn't they be the ones in charge? And there's always been a subset of the population that thinks that. And I would like to think that the true progressive, this isn't the progressive that's a Democrat or the idea of progressivism, of progress, is saying anybody can have power, regardless of how much money they have, regardless of who they are, who their parents were. Anybody can have power. And because of that, we should recognize that democracy is the best path to that, even though it's dirty and can be a winding path. But we've now seen there's a number of tech experiments that have found this, that if you put a big giant jar of gumballs in the corner and you ask one person to guess how many gumballs are in there, he or she's going to be way off. And you ask 10 people, they're all going to be way off. But if you ask 1,000 people and average their responses, you're going to get really close, right? That's the idea of democracy. If you just let one person call the shots or 10 people, you're going to end up way off course. And it's going to be a system that's corrupt and is run for the interests of those people. But if you ask 10,000 people or 10 million people, who do you want to be president? Should we have this law about social media? You're going to get the right answer. That's what I believe. And so, so you need to allow these different people, even with ideas that you don't like, to speak. And the remedy to bad speech is more speech. More people talk. It's like, imagine you're in a room and there's 20 people and one person gets up and says something that's totally abhorrent. You don't just abandon the meeting and cart that guy off to jail. You let somebody else speak, because then you can, and then somebody else. and somebody else, and then you basically come around to like, okay, like this is the more reasonable approach, or this is the approach that the community supports. So I guess I'm giving you a long answer again to your short question, but I think I don't know enough about the Germany situation, but it sounds like from what you're presenting, it's another argument for the utility model of social media.
Well, Mr. Brasunas, thank you so much for being a part of the show. Again, the book is called Red, White, and Blind: The Truth About Censorship. Mr. Brasunas, can you share where folks who are interested in getting a hold of your book can access the book? Where can they order it? Where can they find it?
Yeah, absolutely. So redwhiteandblind.com is the main website. You can just spell that out, redwhiteandblind.com. You can also spell out my name, tonybrasunas.com. You'll find it all there. I have a Substack, Red, White, and Blind at Substack. I think it's redwhiteandblind.substack.com. The book is out January 10th. So I'm not sure when this particular episode is going to air, but the book is out January 10th. You can pre-order it right now at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can go to redwhiteandblind.com to also get a free excerpt of the book, so you can get a taste of it before it's even out. You can follow me also, Tony Brasunas, on Twitter. It's been a real pleasure, Mike, to be on with you, and I love everything that you're doing here on the show. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for being a part of this episode. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and conclude this episode of The Political Mic. Again, as I do every week, I always challenge the viewers and listeners to always challenge the sources of news that they plug into, to compare it with other sources, and to make great educated decisions when it comes down to placing their support behind a public policy solution or political candidate. Thank you so much, Mr. Brasunas, for what you brought to the table. I'm going to go ahead and conclude this episode 90 of the Political Mic podcast. Have a good night.
Thanks to you as well.